Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is William Flick. I'm filling in for Tom D'Ambra tonight. And some of you all know me in the community here in St. Johnsbury. I'm an avid letter writer to the Caledonia Record. I'm sure plenty of you read my letters. Very confusing to some of you. And I'm here to try to clear that up and explain to you that things have been changed on us in our country in a major league way, that our freedoms have been encroached upon in several manners of through law. And what I'd like to do at first is explain something. The Clayton Act is a federal law enacted in 1914. It's an amendment to the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it's to regulate antitrust activity and unfair trade practices. The Act prohibits price discrimination, tying exclusive dealing contracts, mergers, and interlocking directorates. And we're supposed to be stopping monopoly in our system. The system has been set up to prevent monopoly from occurring. In several letters written by Thomas Jefferson, he says freedom from monopoly. And monopoly is any time a group or a person tends to take over a market or lessen the ability for people to make choices in those markets. And that's the marketplace of ideas also. Now, what we've been operating under is something called a de facto government since 1861. And that, according to the Law Dictionary, it says, one that maintains itself by a display of force against the will of the rightful legal government and is successful, at least temporarily, in overturning the institutions of the rightful legal government by setting up its own in lieu thereof. So what we have is a government that's taken the place of the Jefferson and Madison version of what we're supposed to be. And we are currently under an Abraham Lincoln version of what America is. But in the beginning, the United States was only a compact. It was not a corporation. The United States Code Annotated, Title 28 says the term United States means a federal corporation. A corporation is an artificial person created by a grant of government. So you have the government granting itself its own corporation status, which I'm sure Jefferson and Washington didn't want in the beginning. Now, during the Watergate hearings, the committee to investigate the president had a report drawn up, 93549, the 93rd Congress, and it says, a majority of the people of the United States have lived all of their lives under emergency rule. For 40 years, freedoms and governmental procedures guaranteed by the Constitution have in varying degrees been abridged by laws brought into force by states of national emergency. Okay, and it says that this has been going on since at least the Civil War and was promoted even further during the Great Depression. Now, once they realized this, they knew they couldn't go after the president, so they talked him into resigning. Because to have tried to impeach him and bring about the whole process would have revealed that we are no longer under the Constitution. So, I have a little report here. I think that I need to at least explain to you that during the last Depression, our government was essentially, our sovereignty as a people and as a nation was essentially taken away from us. But it all started with the Civil War, the destruction of our decentralized government. We centralized it, totally eliminating the 10th Amendment, which gives the power to the states by way of the citizens. By the inhabitants of each state, the power is derived. We granted the states the power. The states granted the federal government the power. Now, this has gone on since 1860. We went under martial law. Now, I'd like to hold up this chart here, and perhaps I'd encourage people that if they could at least tape this or even copy this chart down. If you'll notice on this side over here, 1776. Now this is just a starting point. Under 1776 it says Compact of Sovereign States. Now, the sovereign freemen, number 2, created the sovereign states, and the sovereign freemen and the sovereign states created the compact called the U.S. Constitution. Now, after that, we have, under that, we have common law. The common law are the traditions of antiquity, the things that we have gone by, the way we carry out our transactions and our involvement with our fellow citizens, were those transactions, the procedures of those transactions were known as common law. Under common law, we bartered. We used things of substance. We bartered for other things of substance. The Constitution requests that we use gold and silver. Now, gold and silver can be barter. But if gold and silver are put into circulation as a debt, the gold and silver is only a token then, like a piece of paper. The gold and silver have to be paid into circulation by the citizens, either individually or collectively by their government that they consent to, which the government derives its power by consent of the governed. And if the government will put the money out, we will be able to use gold and silver as barter. If the banks put it out, it'll be a debt just like the paper. We don't want to deal in debt. You have to get that concept down that gold and silver and all things of substance cannot be issued as a debt or a credit. It has to be paid or traded into circulation. That is a major league fact that is overlooked by all the people that argue about money. We cannot put money out as a debt. Debt and money are the opposites of each other. And at the bottom, number 5, we are practicing free enterprise. That's where an individual builds up his own business and he doesn't sell off shares of it and he doesn't franchise it. Those things are the beginnings of monopoly. Now I'd like to go to a quote out of a book I have called The Debt Virus. You can obtain this book at the library. I received a copy back in '96. It says Debt and Bondage, Chapter 7. And here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. And he spoke these words when he was arguing over the passage of the Banking Act in 1863. Here's something Thomas Jefferson had to say about it. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. Now, what he's saying is inflation and deflation. Banks create money out of thin air. The money is the ledger sheet, the entries on the ledger sheets. I went into a bank down in Woodsville and I asked the gentleman to show me his reserves that he made loans off of. And he laughed at me. And I said, sir, what are you laughing about? And he said, I don't think you'll believe my reserves. And he went to a cabinet. I thought he'd go to the safe or the teller's drawers, but he went to a cabinet in his office, unlocked it, brought a book over, laid it on his desk, and opened it up and said, "Those are my reserves. The ledger entries on the reserve sheets." Now, if there's $1 million in St. Johnsbury floating around, the banks have probably only put out $100,000. The money is just the ledger entries being transferred by checks. Now, in 1912, a committee inside the Congress by the name of the Peugeot Committee lasted for 2 years, and they came up with a concentration of banking power was the problem, was the reason why we had panics through the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was J.P. Morgan, First National Bank, National City Bank, Lee Higginson, Kidder Peabody, Kuhn Loeb, and we know that these banks, some of them have changed their names over the last 100 years. And right now, these banks are actually in control of everything. Right this morning, President Obama has received his marching orders from the international banks. Once again, they've passed new regulations under color of law, force of law, what appears to be law but isn't, public policy, to make sure that the reserve requirements are raised. Now you will only have to have 7% reserve requirements. This is ridiculous. They're counterfeiting money every time they make a loan, and by doing that, they're creating a lower and lower value of each dollar. In 1970, I had an entry-level job making $2 an hour. I made $80 a week for 40 hours. I had an apartment, a car. I went out and partied every weekend like a kid would. I bought clothes, records. I did everything. I fed myself on $80. To live that way today, you would have to have an entry level of $640 a week. Now, there's not a company out there that could afford that. And how did that happen? The United States government and the banks keep issuing more and more money. When the government issues money, they get to take hundreds of billions of dollars and buy products at the current level of prices. After they put that money in circulation, the prices of everything go up around you. This inflation is a hidden tax that the government's been doing for quite a while. And in the 1930s, a congressman by the name of Louis McFadden tried to blow the whistle on the United States government about being in bankruptcy. In the early 30s and the late 20s, there were several Geneva Conventions, and agreements were made by the international banks with the governments that have not been revealed to the populations of the world, and especially the United States. These agreements were on bankruptcy terms. Our government declared bankruptcy, House Joint Resolution 192, 1933. They did it again in 1950. I believe they renegotiated the note when Ross Perot was running because he kept bringing up all the things about the banks going belly up, and then they didn't. And you have to ask yourself, if we have to pay bankruptcies and we don't have gold and silver or substance, then what do we use to make those payments? And the answer is debt. And how do you get debt? By going further into debt, by taking out loans. So it's a pyramid scheme. And it's actually funny because the evidence is almost everywhere. And I'll show you. Everybody's familiar with a savant that has a column in the newspapers. And the name of the column is Ask Marilyn. All right, a lady writes to her, says, "My husband and I would like to give our grandchildren a small monetary gift each birthday that will grow over the years. We considered a $100 savings bond, but a friend told us these bonds actually contribute to the national debt. Is this true?" Marilyn writes back, "In a way, yes. When you buy a U.S. savings bond, you help finance the national debt by giving the government your money to spend. But then the government must pay you interest, thereby increasing the national debt, which the government finances by selling another savings bond. So what you have is a constant debt going after debt, trying to keep up with the interest payments. But the interest payment can never be gotten. Now what's happened is we've gotten to a certain point where they call it a bubble. And once no new debts can come out to help finance the interest on the previous debts, the whole thing starts to implode. Now, the bankers, I asked a banker, in the statement by Thomas Jefferson, he says, first by inflation, then deflation. I asked a banker about that, a banker at the Federal Reserve. What they do is they create the money out of thin air. And as they do that, the prices of everything go up. If the loans start to slow down, the number of loans and the amounts of those loans, which can happen, well, all they would have to do is put a 20% requirement or a collateral requirement on any loan, and that'll slow the loan process. If not enough new loans go out into circulation, all the money in circulation goes back to the bank and is erased out of circulation, paying down the debts because all it is numbers on ledger sheets. Now, in the last year, Barack Obama put out, I believe it was 1.3 to 1.8 trillion, depending on which accounting you get. But it's over $1 trillion in new debt. That new debt got into the citizens' hands, the inhabitants of the several states. They received that money, and when they received it, they brought it back to the banks to pay down the debts that they owed on the houses and cars and whatnot that they paid for. That money is being extinguished out of existence. Now, if the people in the United States don't go back to the banks and bring out the required amounts, we will keep floundering in a downturn in this economy. And this is Louis McFadden was trying to blow the whistle in the first Great Depression. Resolution 158, essentially he indicts the Federal Reserve. Whereas I charge them jointly and severally with having unlawfully exported the United States coins and currency for a sinister purpose, with having deprived the people of the United States of their lawful circulating medium of exchange, and having arbitrarily, unlawfully reduced the amount of money and currency in circulation in the United States to the lowest rate per capita in the history of the United States government. And that's it right there. We need a per capita permanent money supply. And here I found this in a report. I don't know if you can zone in on that at all, but it was a report on money. It says money loaned into circulation is not permanent money. It is a debt owed. Debt-based money must be returned to the creator bank where it is recorded as a bookkeeping figure which is gradually extinguished as the debt is repaid. So what you see is we don't have a permanent money supply. And by not having a permanent money supply, we have to keep going back. Sort of like what they're doing with the seeds now, with the GMO seeds. You have to keep going back. I'm sure they're using the money system model. Now here's the trick. I found this in an insert, a magazine. I am not exactly sure the title of the magazine right now. USA something. It says Americans most indebted, and it goes on to tell you who we're indebted to. The taxpayers owe $2.76 trillion. Excuse me. 20% of the gross national product. All right, so it's the Parade magazine. We're saying that 20%, the 2.76 trillion, is 20% of the gross national product. Now, that is a confusing statement because the gross national product is the debt money being circulated and handed to each person. The money was taken out as a debt and then passed along. Now, each time a person touches that new money, the government will register it as part of the gross national product, the total circulation. Now, so if you're comparing the newly created debt and the gross national product, that's apples and oranges. The gross national product is the accumulation of the circulation of the debt. You're not creating $1 more. The only place you can get more is from a bank as a loan. It is a pyramid scheme. Now, right now, as of this article, which is about a year ago, Japan owes almost $600 billion, $550 by China, United Kingdom $300 billion. We're in trouble, but because we don't understand money. Now, I have this, from a school. A woman I know had her son had this, a comic book, if you will. And it says, what do banks do with all the money that people save? And the teacher says, the loan manager says to the kid, we loan some of the money to people who need to buy things. I'm the loan officer. I help people borrow money from banks. We loan some of the money to people who need to buy things. That's a lie. This is put out by the ABA, the American Bankers Association. This is a lie. So you see that they're training your children to believe that we lend deposits out when they create the money out of thin air. Now, a man by the name of Byron Dale, Tales from the Treasury, he writes letters. If the money supply is to be increased, money must be created. The Federal Reserve Board, or the Fed, as is often called, has several ways of allowing money to be created. But the actual creation of the money always involves the expansion of credit by private commercial banks. This is a problem. Most people don't realize that the banks are creating the money. The Treasury wrote back to this gentleman, and they admitted that the only way you can get the interest payment is through another loan. Here's a New York Magazine article I got out in 1995, The Money Plane. It's all about how we're laundering mob money in the Federal Reserve. Now, how that didn't make the news, I don't know. But this all comes down to something that a lot of people aren't catching on to. Now, we have NAFTA, and we have GATT, and we have the WTO, the United Nations, just on and on. I was in the Nation magazine, and on this January 1995 issue, I don't know if you can pull that up there any better than that, but it says world government begins with 70% of Earth included. And they're promoting the LOST Treaty, the Ocean and Sea Treaty. And so it's a promotion for world government to control the seas, like they don't already now, but they want even more. All right, now this has been going on for quite a while. They've been trying to introduce a world government, and I have in my possession February 19, 1917. February 19, 1917, congressional record. Mr. Callaway, a congressman. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel shipbuilding and powder interests, and their subsidiary organizations got together 12 men up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States and a sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. These 12 men worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers and began an elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of the daily press throughout the country. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers, and agreement was reached. So in other words, they were using the newspapers to control our minds and misinform us, similar to today. Now, back when this was going on, there were hundreds of newspaper outlets. Today, we have 5 corporations running 90% of the media. I could get them in a car and drive them around, and they could decide what reality is going to be on your television set. And that's why you haven't heard this information, and you never will. During the Great Depression, I have a Boston Globe article. I don't know if you can zone in any closer than that on it, but Cloaked Business, Boston Globe. It was a series, and it says, newly declassified files show how Allied firms dealt with Axis through cover of other companies. The secret history of World War II, First National Bank of Boston was linked to Nazi financiers. Now, I think we just heard First National Bank. Okay, now this goes on. I have the oldest newspaper in the United States, the front cover, the internet version, obviously, of the New Hampshire Gazette. Totally conservative. Totally conservative. And why I'm stressing that is the title of the article is Bush/Nazi Link Confirmed. And what this goes on to say is that Prescott Bush, the patriarch of the Bush family, who was around in the early 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, he was a senator from Connecticut, where I'm originally from, when I was a child, that these people were helping to launder money for Adolf Hitler. Now, Prescott Bush was caught. He was fined $250,000, and he worked a deal so he could work Project Paperclip and bring Nazis, scientists, and doctors over here to work on our space program, among other things that we'll never know of because of the black project financing is unaccountable now. There's no accountability. Now, to go on with this, I'd like to go back to this chart. Over here, where am I here? On 1871, an act to establish a government. In 1871, we had been under martial law for 10 years. The Constitution was dissolved. The Congress had been adjourned. And out of the 1871 Act was the beginning of a corporation state. A corporation state means that, number 2, you have corporation personhood. Corporation personhood takes away a lot of the rights you have. It means that you are a franchisee of a corporation. It means that you are no longer the sovereign freeman that has control of your property and your substance. That a corporation is an artificial person granted a charter by a political entity. A corporation used to be just for public works. In the early 1800s, public works, like a canal or a road or a building, that was for the good of everybody. The corporation grant would be put out, the job would be done, and the corporation dissolved. But now we have corporations all over the place, and what happens is corporation has a tendency to help aid and abet in the creation of monopoly. Under the corporation personhood, we have the maritime law. Maritime law uses the Uniform Commercial Code. When we're in an emergency, which we've been in since the Civil War, according to Senate Report 93549, The maritime law is referred to as admiralty law. When you go in the courtroom, you see a fringe around the flag. That is because we're under admiralty jurisdiction. We're in international commercial law. Now, when you enter that courtroom, you have a corporation person they're going to address. They're not going to address the sovereign freemen of the several sovereign states that created the Compact of the United States. Now, when you get people like these people down in New Hampshire that went to court in a regular courtroom and actually told the judge that they had constitutional rights, they're wrong. The rights you have under a corporation state are the constitution of the corporation. That's a different deal. That's public policy. That is not law. Now, under this new system, we went from barter over to credit. Now, credit, we already discovered, is out of thin air. It gives them a monopoly position. We cannot practice free enterprise under a credit system. Free enterprise under a credit system we refer to as capitalism. Monopoly number A. Monopoly number A, capitalism. Now, everybody thinks free enterprise and capitalism are the same. Capitalism is when you practice free enterprise, or so-called free enterprise, under a credit system. The money that you use will not be barter. The products you own will not be barter. Now, let me finish this monopoly system here. The monopoly system, where only a handful of people run everything, and you defer your rights, and you're a corporation, are capitalism A, socialism B, fascism C, and the ultimate monopoly, a monopsony, one supplier, communism. So you have a group of people, plutocrats, ultra-rich, promoting a system of corporation statehood and all the things entailing under it, instead of the system under the 1776 version. So we are living under an Alexander Hamilton, Abraham Lincoln system, where mercantilism, where we go out and we plunder the world in the name of getting richer and richer, and the money goes to the creditors, the same people that operate the banks. And what I mean by that is, now, if you don't understand credit and how the banks work, let's do it a different way. We'll say that I have a company and I raise deer. I slaughter the deer, I use the hides, I make gloves. I go into a friend's store down the street, he makes shoes. I say to my friend, I'd like to get a pair of your shoes, but I don't have any money on me. I'll give you a credit at my store. So I take out my little book with my logo on the top, and I write 1 credit to John Doe's shoe store. Now, John Doe here, he comes back to my store where I make gloves out of deerskin, hands him the credit, and gets a box of gloves. Now, how could I have issued him credit? And the answer is because I own the store. I own the store. I own the gloves I made. He gave me the shoes. I issued him the credit. He redeemed the credit for the gloves. Now, you think that through. The bank is giving you credit. You bring that credit, those numbers on those ledger sheets, you put on a check, and you bring it over to the other bank and you give them that. Now, what you have done is you did the same thing I did with the credit with the shoes and the gloves, except this time you got a house. How could the bank do that? Just like I had the ability to do it because why? Because I own my store. Well, the bank is a company store. They own everything. They own you. Your birth certificate, helps them to set up a loan with you as collateral. When you are born, they set up a straw man corporation in your name under your Social Security number. They use you as the collateral, and they issue credit with you as the collateral. Now, they could only do that if they own everything, just like the store, just like the example I made. They can only do it if they own everything. Now, the solution. There's a gentleman out there, he's been around for quite a while. His name is Ron Paul. Now, I have a few differences with Ron Paul. I'm not a free trader per se. I believe that we're supposed to have tariffs on our borders. And I believe that the libertarian view is that we can just free trade everything, completely. But I believe that we need tariffs to pay for our government. And Ron Paul has issued this, the Federal Reserve Board abolished. The short title, the act may be cited as the Federal Reserve Board Abolition Act. And he's been trying to push this since 1999. Now, they've just started looking into the Federal Reserve. To private corporations, creates money out of thin air, and now they're giving them more power. We have to get back to a treasury-based system. If we continue to go on this way, we're going to just continue to go downhill. Like I said, the money will keep being erased out of existence. We will not be able to keep up with the extinguishing of the money. The new loans coming out will not be able to keep up with it because they created a bubble that was way bigger than the money system can handle. And until it averages out, which may not happen for quite a while due to the fact that we have such a disparity in our population. And this is where aborting 50 million people come in. When we have fewer people to take out loans to keep the money supply high. So we have just the demographics alone will force us to go into a spiral, a downward spiral, because we can't take out enough money to keep the money supply at the place it's at. Now, there's a way that we can stop this tomorrow. If they would just pass a law stopping the creation of money by the banks, in that same law, they could move the banks under the Federal Reserve, absorb the Federal Reserve into the Treasury. Now, the Treasury has to be taken back and put back under the administration instead of being under the IMF. There's been so many deals behind the scenes with the Geneva Conventions that it would take quite an ordeal to unravel this pretzel of corruption that they've got us involved in. Now, the Federal Reserve, they get on television all the time, and what you'll find is that the Federal Reserve and Wall Street and the CIA, all these people are, they're going through a revolving door. On Wall Street, there's a office law firm by the name of Cromwell, I'm not sure, Cromwell and Sullivan. And Cromwell and Sullivan almost always is involved with the CIA directors, the assistant directors, any of the bigwigs. They come from Wall Street firms. So there's absolutely a connection to Wall Street. Now, there's another thing going on with all of this. When you look around the world, you find things like in London, there's an area where the banks are in London that is a sovereign unto itself called the city. Now, in the world, there are several places like this. These are all part of the international banking house's monopoly, not only on the banks, on the central banks, but on the markets, where the markets are like Wall Street. In the United States, we have Wall Street. We have Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. Who can explain that? How is that an entity unto itself? In Italy, they have the Vatican. In China, they have Hong Kong. There's something going on, and it's not being described and defined to the people. And most people can't tell you what's going on. We don't understand why World War I happened. We don't understand why World War II happened, although they had a lot to do with Adolf Hitler being financed. The Russians, I went into the congressional record looking into FDR right after he was inaugurated in May of 1933, and I found loans going to the Soviet Union, of all places. While we had 30% unemployment in 1933, they were sending $350 million to build a truck factory for the Russian army in Gorky. And at that time, it was the largest truck factory in the world. Ford Motors and GM were in on it. Now, this is going on while we had 25 to 30% unemployment in the United States. This went on right up. We're still aiding and abetting Russia. Russia has never really been the enemy. That is all a ruse created by the international banks, so you and I will fight the wars that they'll finance and buy the weapons that they finance with the loans they give. This is all just a complete ruse that's being run on the United States people. And now they have things like, in the United States, like myself here, I could be considered an enemy of the state. There are people in the St. Johnsbury area I know of that work for a group called InfraGard. It's a snitching. It's like the brown shirts in Germany. They turn in their neighbors for anything and everything, writing a letter to the editor that might be considered radical. Now, under the current system, radical means you think like Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. So you have to decide which person do you want to be? Do you want to be a free person or do you want to be a corporation person? If you want to be a free person, you're going to have to think in terms of barter, free enterprise. You're going to have to take back the common law, deal within the states within your communities, buy local, do whatever you can to circumvent the corporation. And the corporation is the United States government also. And I love it when I run into people that lean to the left in the monopoly system. They're socialists or in that vogue. And they talk about the corporation status, the personhood status of corporations. And the personhood status, it's not equal to us. They haven't been brought up to our level. We've been brought down to their level. We are corporation people only through these tricks of law. Now, what you need to do is to look into this. You don't need to be believing me. The first place to do is, if you know a lawyer, ask him if we're a de facto government. If he says yes, then you know it's true what I'm saying to you. A de facto government is an illegitimate government, but in effect. The 4th edition of Black's Law Dictionary, it says usurped power, stolen power, through the threat of force, under the color of law, what appears to be law, but isn't. So you have all these people running around out here with uniforms on that are color of law officers for a de facto court. Now, when you go in the courtroom, the King's Court, they use the King's money. What money do they use? Federal Reserve notes. Who is the sovereign? The Federal Reserve. And who are they? They are owned by the international banks. We have a world government behind the scenes. It is known as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, the Club of Rome, the Committee of 300, the 13, and the 5. Now, these groups are all being run as insider groups, as secret societies. The man who runs the controversial mosque in New York City, that imam, is today speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, that's in the news today. This is absurd that people don't see what's going on. All of our presidential candidates are surrounded by council members, trilateral commission members, the Bilderberg Group members, our military leaders go to these groups behind the scenes, outside of the press coverage, and people aren't being told. Our government is secret. We have no accountability of the CIA, of the banking system. We are being fleeced so they can build a world government. And this is not just the beginning right now. This is in place. It has been in place. Smedley Butler blew the whistle on their attempt in 1934. Ford Motors and the Ford and Remington family, the Reynolds family, they all wanted Hitler's style of government. They wanted fascism in the United States. They are continuing to want fascism. Fascism, they will sell you it as socialism, sort of like Obama. People are saying Obama's a socialist. Well, I don't have health care. I have to buy health care from a private corporation at gunpoint now. That's not socialism. That's fascism. The government working with the corporations. But worse, the government is a corporation. The government is not supposed to be a corporation. Our government was originally intended to be a compact of sovereign states. We delegated the authority to them. Read the 10th Amendment. The 9th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the federal government or the states are retained by the people. You have whatever powers you think you have and rights you think you have. I talk to gay people all the time. They want the government to sanction them. We don't want the government to sanction us. We want the government to leave us alone, for all of us to be evenly treated. And that means when we go into a bank, when we deal in the courts, we are not getting justice. They are exploiting the fact that we are debtors and we're in debtor courts. They're exploiting all that through laws, through the trickery of law, because they know people don't understand law. Now, if you don't know a lawyer, you can ask a policeman. Maybe a policeman will be nice enough to admit that they are a de facto government official. The de facto status has to be eliminated. We need to get back to a lawful government, a government of form and substance, a lawful government, a government that follows the law, which is the Constitution, not every statute that a majority rule puts in place. A majority is just two foxes and a chicken voting on dinner. Democracy is a way to get to tyranny. Democracy under our current government is supposed to be under law, under the rule of law. And the rule of law is that the people that aren't in the majority do not lose their rights and their property and their substance to the majorities. That is what's going on now. That is organized theft. That is absolutely organized theft. And the only solution is to take the Federal Reserve back, put it under the Treasury, take the Treasury back, put it under the administrative branch. The whole system has been turned into a huge pretzel of unlawful laws, illegal laws, and a system of exploitation, corruption, and everybody is starting to notice how bad it is. Now, 20 years ago, I read a book by a gentleman by the name of Ravi Batra. Dr. Batra is the head of the Southern Methodist Economics Department. And he had written a book in the late 70s called The Downfall of Capitalism and Communism. He wrote that book. I was reading that book in 1989 leading into 1990. He described the dissolution of the Soviet Union because of the corruption. And he said that the United States would start to see that kind of corruption by the year 2005. Dr. Batra is right. We are near the end of what is known as the Inquisitor era. We're going to have a police state. Do we want it for a week, a month, a year, so we can reorganize back to a sovereign, lawful state where you and I are sovereign individuals not in commerce, not in international law, but under common law and United States U.S. constitutional law. Do we want that, or do we want to continue down this path of monopoly and debt and corporation personhood? These are the choices that you're going to have to make. You need to look into this stuff. There are places to go. You could start by, there's a website, Infowars.com, thepowerhour.com, thepatriots.us. If you go to those websites, there are links to several more. There are books in the library. There's a book in the library in St. Johnsbury called Social Ferment in Vermont. It'll show you that in Vermont, we fought the world government almost 200 years ago. This area in Vermont, the Northeast Kingdom, was a hotbed against the Illuminati, the people inside those secret societies, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the Committee of 300, the 13 and the 5. By the way, one of the 5, it's a high committee inside Freemasonry, is George Shultz. I see his name all over the place now on PBS. If you watch PBS and you watch Fox, you are being misinformed. These people are dividing you up amongst which monopoly you want to be. They are not telling you this information. They're not going to tell you the information. There's just, it's all up to you. It's up to you. There are people in the community. If you see somebody with a set of bumper stickers, maybe they might know where to have some information. Please, talk to your neighbors. It is the compartmentalization of our society that has led us to this ridiculous spot. We have even local officials that are playing into their hands, thinking that they're insiders. But the local officials have to know they will be the feed on the machinery when it goes down. They will also be fed to it. They will also be in the concentration camps with all the other people. The only people that will not be there will be the insiders that are helping this all go down at the top levels. And believe me, there are plenty of them, and there's a lot of this going on. So, in conclusion, I would ask that everybody get busy. We have a very short window. Vote for constitutionalists first. If you don't know where they stand, find out. Do not go with the parties. The parties are part of the monopoly system, a monopoly of power through the banks. And I appreciate you letting me be here tonight, and I thank you very much.